For nearly 150 years, Bodmin Jail was the kind of place that you entered through those imposing gates and prayed that you would one day leave again, because not everyone did. But even after its closure and transformation into a luxury hotel, Bodmin Jail just can't erase its dark past. People still describe this prison as unsettlingly active. Visitors have reported shadowy figures lingering in long empty wings. Staff members have been reminded of deadly anniversaries by phantom noises. And some parts of the jail still carry such an oppressive atmosphere that people feel an overwhelming need to leave immediately, as if they're intruding somewhere they're not welcome. Because whatever continues to be trapped inside Bodmin Jail doesn't want to let you forget about it. So in part 1 of this story, we covered the history as well as some utterly brutal crimes that were committed by prisoners who were held and executed here at Bodmin Jail in Cornwall. And a whole bunch of them are said to still be haunting the old prison. But in part 2, we're now getting into everyone else that people say never left once the prison closed its doors in 1927. And these stories, they go from unsettling to downright eerie, all the way to utterly terrifying. And we've got to start exactly where we left off last time, down in the darkest depths of the basement, namely the passageway that would have connected the hanging pit to the morgue. Because alongside the uncomfortable presence of William Hampton, the last man to be hanged at Bodmin, being encountered in this area, there is an altogether darker, much more oppressive energy festering down there. And while it isn't witnessed as an actual figure and it can't be traced back to a particular human, it has been given the nickname the Get Out Man. People will feel an all-consuming urge that they need to leave the basement immediately. Doesn't matter how keen they were beforehand, they will stop at nothing to be back above ground as soon as possible. But other times, this entity is a bit more forceful when it comes to making you aware of just how it feels. Because on multiple occasions, the sound of an angry man shouting "Get out" has been heard. And it's always heard 3 times. Get out, get out, get out! As this guy sounds like he's getting more and more agitated with you in his space. And it sounds so real that when a staff member heard this while doing a tour, they immediately went back down into the basement, assuming that it must have been a visitor from the group who had gotten all turned around and confused. Only when they scoured the basement, they didn't find a living soul. So while they called him the Get Out Man, let's be so for real right now, that still sounds like a cute nickname for something that is absolutely vile. You don't need to tell me twice, let alone 3 times, Mr. Possibly Not Even a Man. I am more than happy to give you your space. But if we come back upstairs, there is an entity that has been seen walking around the wings of the prison. Because you can't have a haunted old county jail without at least one ghostly guard. He's witnessed wearing an old Victorian uniform and appears to be accompanied by the smell of matchsticks burning. A lot of sources that I found claimed that this particular ghost was, in life, a warder called George, and he apparently died on the job of a massive heart attack. And looking into the records, there are a few Georges who have worked at the prison over the years, as it's not exactly an uncommon name, but from what I could see, none of them died of a heart attack at work. So I can't tell you exactly who this warder was, as we just don't know specifically, but I can tell you that people swear blind that they've seen him. But if you want the creepiest example of ghostly prison staff keeping an eye on you long after they've clocked out for the final time, you only have to find yourself in the naval wing. Especially if you just so happen to be on the last heritage tour of the day, around 5 PM. Your tour guide might tell you of the history here, a few stories of prisoners who once occupied these cells, that sort of thing. But what you may also notice is that someone is standing on the stairs, away from the group. And you'll know that they're there because you'll see, plain as day, their uniformed trousers. Because of where the ceiling is in this wing now, that's all you'll see. Just this person's legs standing on the stairs with their set of keys jangling to the side of them. And then the rest of them, from the trousers up, is obscured by the ceiling. And this is said to be the ghost of a former member of staff who regularly seems to appear at 5 PM. So he's most often spotted by this tour group. It's obviously rather unsettling just seeing this ghostly pair of legs standing there motionless. But I suppose thinking back to the prison's heyday, that ceiling wouldn't have been there, and that may well have been where a prison warder stood overlooking the wing, making sure everyone was behaving. And so now in death, this entity appears to have continued his watch. But the one thing that interested me most was that older sources only talked about the ghostly warder George, but the modern day jail attraction makes no mention of a George, but does talk about this uniformed entity standing halfway on these stairs. So whether this is the same entity being given different names as the jail evolves from abandoned shell to visitor attraction, or whether they are two separate entities, the main thing to take away from this is that you might get more than you bargained for on the last history tour of the day. But the naval wing itself, that area where you can see how those cells would have looked back in the day, it's got so much more going on. That phantom jailer is just overseeing it all. The distinctive sound of keys rattling around has been heard, even when no one's about. Heavy footsteps echoing around the room sometimes accompanies it, as if replaying a jailer coming to collect a prisoner who's no longer there. Apparently, on paranormal investigations, speaking French in this area is likely to elicit a response, whether that's from any French sailors who were imprisoned here during the naval prison days, or a bit more bleak, could it be any of the French prisoners of war who built this prison brick by brick in the 18th century? There's no mention of anyone dying during construction, but even so, it was probably a miserable, hellish time, and that energy could have seeped into the granite stones. Throughout this wing, though, a lot of people complain of, again, similar to the basement, a heavy, unpleasant atmosphere that sometimes does affect visitors physically. When they reopened after the big refurbishment, apparently it was very common for visitors to just straight up pass out, especially when they were near the old Victorian cells. No explanation. And what I found really interesting is that this ground floor, obviously before the ceiling, it would have still been the darkest part of the wing back then, furthest away from any natural light. It would have been gloomy. And this floor is where new arrivals were sent first, so that they could check out your behaviour, but also it was where the most difficult, dangerous prisoners were kept. Talk about an introduction to prison. And so then where you were in the wing became the physical symbol of your reform. The better you behaved, the higher up the wing you moved, literally closer to the light. And maybe that's why, even now, this ground floor part of the museum has the worst atmosphere. Sometimes, for women and children, the floor is okay, bearing in mind that before it was the naval wing, it was the place where women and children were imprisoned. But some women do report feeling very unwelcome in the punishment room at the far end. It's where they've got all the kit set up for showing what hard labour would have been like, basically. But you'll suddenly get hit with this nope, I'm not supposed to be in here feeling out of nowhere. And some even feel like something is physically pushing them out of the room. Which is again, very interesting, as that exact room used to be the office for the naval wing. A men-only space back in the day. No girls allowed. Girls allowed. But then, there's one cell in the naval wing where no one feels welcome. It's cell 4, and you'll know which one that is, as if you're there during the day, it's blocked off. You can't actually get to it. And it was in 2019 when a lot of major work was done in this wing, and builders who were working in this cell in particular started to complain of feeling super uncomfortable in there. They mentioned that it was almost like there was someone standing way too close behind them, ignoring all notion of personal space. But when they turned around, there would be no one there. And younger men seemed to suffer the worst of it though, as they would be grabbed by something that they couldn't see. But to try and help the builders feel more comfortable working in there, a blessing was conducted on the cell. Didn't make a difference. So they tried once more, just doing another cleansing. But again, it failed. The activity continued, and so instead, once the work was done in that cell, it was locked up and sealed from the public. Not that that seems to have stopped the activity. Nowadays, it seems to be women that suffer the most around here, as they report being violently pushed away from the cell. Sometimes they even feel icy hands around their throat. Other times, the door itself will just randomly unlock and swing open, as if that evil energy is ready to let itself out for a wander around the prison. Yeah, don't be putting your icy hands on me, thank you. Although, I did try and tempt fate, or the big bad ghost, when I was there and did stand outside the cell for an extended period of time. Nothing happened. Elsewhere in the prison, the atmosphere isn't as aggressive, but just as creepy. Where the condemned cell is, the place where prisoners would have spent their final nights on this earth, the figure of a man has been seen, sobbing his heart out. And the story goes that he was one of the prisoners who was executed, but I don't think we have a name for who he was. And there is another reminder of that dark history of Bodmin Jail that seems to manifest at really eerie times, because the phantom tolling of a bell has been heard, ringing throughout the prison and the surrounding area too, usually in the early hours of the morning. And it's easy to brush that off as a church bell nearby or something, right? Only this bell sounds different, and it isn't heard ringing every day, on the hour, or anything like that. Whenever this bell is heard, staff members will always think to check the board that stands on display next to the execution shed. And apparently, without exception, whenever that bell rings, it's the anniversary of someone who was executed executed here. Yeah, no, that is something else. I don't know if it rings without fail on everyone's death anniversary, or if it's just when it's heard, it happens to be the date of someone's execution, but yeah, that's eerie. But I do feel like that's a good word that sums up Bodmin anyway, eerie. Even though it's been done up with tens of millions spent on it, underneath those boutique bedrooms and the information boards and all of that, if you do end up in a quiet part of the prison on your own, it's not hard to be aware of that atmosphere. And even if you didn't come to Bodmin Jail for a history lesson, you just wanted to stay in a cool hotel, that history might turn around and smack you in the face anyway. Guests staying the night at Bodmin commonly report strange things going on in their converted prison cells, especially in rooms 304 to 311. They seem to be the most active. Although it doesn't really matter, anywhere in the hotel, you are not safe from a ghost at your bedside. Turn down service not included. The taps in the ensuite bedrooms have been known to turn on full force, even though there's no one near them. And the sounds of children crying and women murmuring and sobbing have been heard too, within the confines of your room. As in, it's distinctly happening inside your bedroom. You're not hearing it through the walls or anything like that. Not like the walls are particularly thin, being a converted Victorian prison. A lot of guests say that they wake up in the middle of the night with the unmistakable sense that someone is watching them, just instantly putting your brain on high alert. Others feel like their feet are being pulled at the end of the bed by something they can't see. Don't love that. Leave me alone while I'm in bed. That is my safe space, thank you. In the hotel bar, staff members have seen things that they can't explain either. There was once a barman who went to serve the next customer waiting, a fella wearing a greatcoat and a flat cap. As he was about to ask what he would like to drink, the man in the flat cap disappeared. Just dematerialised right in front of his face. Cheaper than an Uber home, I suppose. But with Bodmin Jail, there are so many stories about the ghosts of long gone prisoners still haunting the building. Yeah, I couldn't even cover them all in part one, so I've got more for you. One story that seems to be really infamous in Bodmin is that of Anne Jeffreys. And it's not a usual story. Anne was a young servant girl in nearby St. Teth, and in 1645 she claimed that she was approached in the garden by 6 little men in green coats, and they were sort of shimmering, the way that old fairy folklore describes them. After that, she fell into this catatonic, trance-like state for days. And when she came round, Anne had powers. She could heal people and predict things that were going to happen, and apparently she stopped eating entirely because she claimed her new fairy mates were sustaining her. Which is a bold thing to announce in the 1640s. You've got the Civil War in England, a time when witch hunting was super intense. We were only a couple of years off Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, publishing his work, The Discovery of Witches. So yeah, going around saying things like that, the locals reported her, and she was imprisoned for communing with evil spirits. The story goes that while she was imprisoned, they starved her and denied her water to test the claim, and she survived for months. But here is where it gets a little weird, because she was apparently released and went on to live to a grand old age on the moor, which, if she genuinely wasn't withering away after months with no food or water, that seems like more concrete evidence for communing with evil spirits than having a weird looking birthmark or owning a cat or chatting back to your husband. So it's strange that they let her go. But even so, people now claim that Anne Jeffreys has come back after her death, and some believe she haunts Bodmin Jail. There's an issue with that, and those of you who are paying attention should have already sussed out why. Although, if you're working right now, or doing housework, or even just mindlessly scrolling on your phone while this is on in the background, I'm not offended. I am just happy to be your emotional support background noise. But in case you didn't catch the problem already, the reason that I find it highly unlikely that Anne Jeffreys is haunting Bodmin Jail, aside from the obvious not dying here, was because ... she never even set foot in that particular prison. She was found guilty of witchcraft in the 1640s. Bodmin Jail wasn't opened until 1779. So Anne couldn't have been held here, and so she'd have no reason to haunt it, because she was actually kept under house arrest at the mayor's house, about 1.5 miles away. But it's an interesting story that commonly gets talked about with Bodmin, so I wanted to include it anyway. Although, there is another famous story that is directly connected to Bodmin Jail concerning witchcraft. And this is a little bit of a ghost story, but it's more just one of the most tragic tales of disrespect I have come across during this research, possibly ever. And it's not just in life. This poor woman couldn't catch a break long after her death either, because Joan White, known as the Fighting Fairy Woman of Bodmin, was imprisoned here in the early 1800s for brawling. But unlike Anne Jeffreys, Joan wasn't called the Fairy Woman for communing with spirits or anything like that. She was called that because she was tiny, barely 5 foot tall, slim as anything, and yet apparently fully capable of clocking someone in the jaw if they gave her a reason, which unfortunately they did a lot. Joan made her living as a healer and a clairvoyant, and while the early 1800s wasn't full-blown witch hunt England anymore, Bodmin still made her life miserable. People mocked her, they would heckle her in the street, and just treated her awfully. But Joan, being the little firecracker that she was, would stand up for herself, meaning she got into fights a lot. Eventually though, this attitude of if they hit you, hit them back harder, got Joan in trouble, and that's how she ended up in Bodmin Jail. Unfortunately, while she was imprisoned, Joan caught pneumonia and passed away in 1813, aged 38. During her autopsy, they found a massive abscess under one of her wisdom teeth. A full-on, untreated abscess under your wisdom tooth. That pain would have been unimaginable. So it was absolutely no surprise to anyone that the poor woman was in a bad mood all the time. Fair play, Joan. I wouldn't have any patience for anyone either. But after her death, things somehow got even worse. Her body was claimed by a surgeon who wanted to dissect her, only he never actually collected her. So instead, her bones were simply stored at the prison. And so if you thought she got a raw deal so far, it gets a whole lot worse. The jail's governor at the time, William Higgs, he was hosting a dinner party for some friends, and being a typical Victorian obsessed with spiritualism and death, he decided it would make fantastic dinner time entertainment to set up a seance using Joan's bones. Guess worse, her bones were laid out on the table while guests asked questions, and men were hidden nearby to make the skeleton rap noises back, as in rapping, not rapping. Yeah, just utterly grotesque. Poor woman couldn't be left alone in death. Well, the seance was a right hoot for everyone involved, barring obviously poor Joan herself. Her bones were then locked in storage within the prison until it closed its doors in 1927. Why just shove her in a cupboard for over 100 years though? Why not just bury her and you're free of the bones then, you don't have to worry about them, and she can be at peace? Or was it a case of, we didn't execute her and no one has come to claim her, so burying her is the definition of not my job? I don't know. In the 1950s though, Joan's skeleton was put up for auction, and the winning bid was from none other than Cecil Williamson, the founder of the Museum of Witchcraft, about 40 minutes north of Bodmin in Boscastle. Joan's bones were stitched together with wire, and her skeleton was strung up in the museum in the 1960s, as a really macabre finale for the visitors walking around the museum. Look, you've seen all of these artifacts, and now here are the bones of a real witch. It wasn't until 1996 though, when the museum's new owner, Graham King, he actually took her down and displayed her instead in a coffin. I mean, going in the right direction, I suppose. But apparently Joan, never being one to take things quietly, she supposedly told museum staff exactly what she thought, as sometimes the lid to this coffin would close on itself inexplicably, and it didn't take long for Graham to reach the same conclusion too. In October 1998, she was buried in Minster Woods, just outside Boscastle, and his reasons behind why he buried her sum up the whole situation perfectly. That it was an act of respect and sympathy to a woman who had been subjected to ill treatment during her lifetime, and then careless disregard since her death. And so while her actual burial spot remains a secret, you can still visit her little memorial stone just outside the churchyard at Minster Church. You just cannot fathom the mistreatment of that poor woman though, can you? Mocked and abused through her life, and then her remains being exploited and disrespected like that. That would probably be enough for me to come back as a ghost, I'd say. And while there's nothing in Joan's story to suggest that she ever cursed Bodmin Jail for what was done to her, which again, wouldn't blame her if she had, apparently one person did. Her name was Rose Wright, another local healer who made herbal remedies for villagers, until an awful drought hit and a bunch of their crops failed. Her village immediately turned on her and decided, yeah, the crops are failing, that must have been the witch. Rose was born in 1811, so again, well past the proper witch hunt craze, but she was shunned by her former customers, and that meant no income. So Rose retreated into the nearby woods and began befriending the animals instead. I'd be inclined to say that the animals were probably better company than the villagers anyway. But in particular, she became close with jackdaws. And jackdaws, in case you didn't know, are scarily intelligent. They can recognise faces, they build trust with you, and they can bring you little gifts. But the story goes that one day, one of her jackdaw mates produced a very useful gift, a few shillings. Well, this was going to change things for the woman who was desperate, starving and unable to provide an income for herself. She trained the jackdaws, who learned very quickly, and before long, she had a pretty decent stash of money and jewellery. But you can't really run a Corvid-based crime ring for long before someone notices. Rose was arrested and imprisoned in 1846, but at that point she was already so unwell with malnutrition and dysentery. The jackdaws supposedly followed her into the jail, making things rather difficult for everyone else. They'd harass inmates and staff, and they even tried to steal the cell keys, although unsuccessfully. But Rose didn't recover, and she died just 2 months later, on the 13th of January 1847. And with her last breath, legend says that she placed a curse on Bodmin Jail, that when the last jackdaw is born there, the spirits of the condemned will rise, bringing misfortune and chaos to all who reside within. And I mean, I didn't see any jackdaws at the prison when we were there. So has the curse come to pass? And then the spirits of the condemned really are causing chaos to those who reside within, say, in a hotel room? But there is another legend tied to Bodmin Jail, and this one's ghostly influence apparently stretches well beyond the prison walls. Her name was Sarah Polgreen, and if you visited the attraction in recent years, you might recognise her as one of the prisoners featured in the Dark Walk attraction, although it doesn't tell you the full supernatural story. Sarah had a really bleak start in life. She was born in the late 1780s, and her father died when she was young, after which her mother abandoned her as a 4-month-old, so she was raised by the parish. Once she grew up, she married a soldier and moved to London, but that marriage failed, and eventually she returned to Cornwall, where she married again, this time to Henry Polgreen. But it wasn't a happy marriage. There were rumours that Sarah had a lover, a man known only as Yorkshire Jack, and Henry was said to be a violently jealous man. On the 14th of July 1820 though, Henry Polgreen fell seriously ill and died not too long afterwards. At first, it was ruled natural causes, although witnesses later claimed that this grieving widow said that she'd be damned if she didn't poison the villain, and that if she were to ever marry again it would be for love, for she had not loved that man now in the ground any more than she would love a dog. So not exactly inconsolable at her husband's untimely passing. Naturally, with Sarah saying these not so grieving widow-like things, people got suspicious, and 11 days after his burial, Henry was dug up for an autopsy, where they found arsenic in his stomach. Ah, right. Not a natural cause. It transpired that, yeah, Sarah had recently bought arsenic, claiming that they had a rat problem at home, except there were no rats. The whole thing was rumbled. Sarah had administered the poison in a cut-off piece of butter, which Henry used on his bread, while she ate from the main pad. She was found guilty and so sentenced to death at Bodmin Jail. And when that day came, on the 12th of August 1820, on the scaffold, Sarah asked for Yorkshire Jack to accompany her. Sarah recited the Lord's Prayer out loud and then confessed her guilt, saying that it was her husband's well-founded jealousy and her aversion to him that had led to her poisoning him. Well-founded jealousy, yeah. I'd say, as your boyfriend was allegedly there on the scaffold with you. They said their goodbyes to each other, and just before the deed was done, Sarah asked him, "You will?" To which he replied, "I will." So ominous, what does it mean? Jack later claimed that he'd promised to marry Sarah, living or dead, within 3 years. But after her execution, he became withdrawn and looked terrified. And as the 3-year anniversary of Sarah's death approached, he enlisted as a sailor, possibly thinking that maybe he could outrun whatever promise that he'd made. But the story goes that during a violent storm out in Mounts Bay, sailors heard something completely impossible. The sound of wedding bells ringing through the wind. At that very moment, Jack was washed overboard and drowned in the stormy sea. Sounds like Sarah got her man in the end, then mayhaps? To this day, local legend says that storms in the area still carry the sounds of bells and a man's voice saying, "I will." And Sarah herself is said to haunt the churchyard near where she grew up in Ludgfen, appearing in white along with the faint outline of a noose. Which is interesting because, as a prisoner who was executed at Bodmin Jail, she wouldn't have been buried off the property. But apparently she has also been seen at Bodmin Jail too, where she appears near the old infirmary and morgue, what is now the courtroom in the Dark Walk. And after her execution, her body was dissected and her heart was removed and preserved. And if that took place anywhere inside Bodmin Jail, the old infirmary would be the obvious place. So maybe that's why she's seen there? Man, being stuck haunting the area that's got the recording of a judge sentencing you to death on a loop over and over again every single day for the delight of visitors. That is a rough afterlife. But if that story of Jack is true, I would say just don't make any promises to murderous women. Unless Yorkshire Jack had already promised to marry her before she poisoned Henry, and then was just keeping up the line at the end, like, yes, of course, darling, absolutely, anything you want, because maybe he didn't fancy being on the receiving end of a bread and butter sandwich from her? I don't know. But between everything that we have covered in part 1 and all the stories people still tell about Bodmin today, it's safe to say that this place ain't exactly short on ghosts. But we're not done with the place just yet, because supposedly one of the entities haunting this site isn't even from the prison. Some suggest that it actually predates the 1779 construction, because in one of the old Victorian cells, people have described seeing the figure of a hooded monk standing completely still in the shadows. Hate that image. He's been nicknamed the Melted Monk, because while he's usually seen with his hood obscuring his face, on the rare occasions that people do catch a glimpse underneath, they describe something horrifying. His face looks distorted, almost as if it's melted. What? Yeah. And yes, I know that a hooded monk ghost is basically a free pass on a paranormal bingo card, but Bodmin actually does have a good reason for him to be seen here, because the town itself has been a religious site for over 1,000 years. There was a monastery founded here all the way back in the 6th century. In fact, the name Bodmin comes from the Cornish for dwelling of or sanctuary for the monks. And so now that's getting real interesting, because is it just another ghost story that's attached itself to the prison over time? Or is Bodmin Jail built on something significant? Something much older? What was this site used for way before it was a parcel of land sold off to become the new county jail? And what happened to this guy for his face to appear like that? It's just raising all sorts of questions. But basically, you're left with the impression that no matter where you stand in Bodmin Jail, you're rolling the dice on what might be standing there next to you. A long dead prisoner, or a guard who's still on shift, or something else entirely. I can see why a lot of people believe, without question, that Bodmin Jail is one of the most haunted prisons in the country. It's quite funny that Bodmin do actually have this Aldi versus M&S level social media beef going on with Shept and Mallet, with both of them fighting for the crown of most haunted prison in Britain, which, yeah, has been quite entertaining to watch unfold. But that brings us to the other side of Bodmin's hauntings, because nowadays it is a place that really leans on its ghostly reputation. The paranormal is a huge income stream here. They have ghost hunts, ghost tours, they sell haunted themed merch in the gift shop, where we did actually buy our own ghost because he was so darn cute. Look at that little guy. Adorable. But also, they have a whole exhibit dedicated to the paranormal, full of your classic haunted object paraphernalia. They have a crying boy painting, they have a Raggedy Ann doll made infamous by Annabelle. They also have paranormal tech on display and information boards set up on the history of paranormal as a whole, not necessarily related to the prison itself. And I've said before on this channel, when historic places are able to make an income like that, absolutely fair play. That money keeps places like this alive and safe from being flattened and turned into new builds. But it is worth keeping in mind that when a place is framed like that, people walk in already braced to some degree for something to happen. And sometimes that expectation can shape then what they notice. But Bodmin has been part of that whole paranormal entertainment realm for years. TV crews have locked down overnight here, YouTubers hire it out hoping to contact the spirit of an executed prisoner, but none are more infamous in Bodmin's lore than Most Haunted themselves. Yeah, we're talking about it, because it was right here in Bodmin Jail where possibly one of the most controversial moments of Most Haunted happened. Dr. Kieran O'Keefe, the resident skeptic, decided to test Derek Acorah, the show's medium, by feeding him a fake spirit name, Creed Kafer, supposedly a South African jailer. And wouldn't you know it, during his walk around, Creed Kafer immediately started coming through to Derek inside Bodmin Jail. So then, of course, it all came out in the wash. Creed Kafer wasn't real and was, in fact, an anagram of Derek. Faker. Savage. And as a little bonus detail, the exact spot where Derek got possessed by a made-up ghost got turned into a public toilet after the big renovation, which feels right. Obviously, it wasn't Bodmin's fault or anything like that, but it's just a super significant moment in the history of British ghost television that happened right here. But between TV crews and ghost hunts and the way it's all presented, you can see how people might go in already expecting something to happen. And I'm sure that that is the case for some people. But even with all of that, the sheer number and consistency of reports from on countless visitors and hotel guests walking away with experiences that they genuinely cannot explain is interesting. And some of you shared your own encounters in the comments of part 1 of this series too. And so thank you for that. I absolutely love reading them, and I wanted to share a couple here too. So Bethany Hudson shared that I went for the first time last August with my mum, stepdad and my 1-year-old daughter. While we were doing the tour in the cells underground, I was carrying my daughter and she suddenly started waving and giggling. I turned around thinking it was maybe my mum, but we were the only ones in the cell. She was waving, playing peekaboo, the lot. I was a bit spooked, so I walked out of the cell and realised that it was the cell of Selena. Safe to say, I was holding Sophie extra tight after that visit. Selena Wadge being one of the executed prisoners that we spoke about in the first part. But no, when your kid starts giggling and interacting with something that you cannot see, take that as your sign that it's time to go. But in Bodmin, Selena's cell does seem to be a reasonably active hotspot. As Sarah's Days Out commented that I had a weird experience at Bodmin the first time I visited, and this was before they turned some of the museum into a hotel. I was in the cell that told the story of Selena and I felt a weight on my back and shoulders. This feeling didn't go away until we drove out of Bodmin. Not sure what it was, but I did joke and say that Bodmin had changed since they were last there. She also did mention that it didn't feel like whatever it was evil, but it just wanted some freedom for a bit. So you can renovate the cells, turn them into hotel rooms, pour millions into making it beautiful. But beneath all of that, it is still a prison. And the stories people bring back from inside suggest that something there is still watching and making sure that you know it's there. But now it is over to you. Do you think the Bodmin Jail is haunted? Do you think it's all just hammed up for the marketing value? Do you think it's somewhere in between? Have you ever had an experience there that made you go, yeah, there is definitely something going on here? Because I think for me, the place is haunted. Not that I experienced anything while I was there, but because the sheer weight of what that place has seen. I mean, just look at the history. It started its life built on the suffering of others, the French prisoners of war who built the place. And while it was supposed to be this new era of care and reform for criminals, it was still a prison in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century. It was not a nice place to be. It would have been miserable. Criminals who had done terrible things were executed on this site. Some were executed who may not have even been guilty. We don't know. And that's a lot of strong, dark energy. And I think that the stories that convinced me the most were the ones that came out before the massive redevelopment. People claiming to encounter strange things in the dilapidated naval wing, and even the story in part 1 about tablecloths being pulled off the table during its time as a nightclub. But on the other side of it, it does always make me raise an eyebrow when a place leans this hard into the paranormal. That is worthy of retaining your pinch of salt. But tell me your thoughts, your feelings about the hauntings of Bodmin Jail. And if you enjoyed this video, please do let me know by leaving it just a little like. And if you haven't already, but you love stuff like this, please do subscribe too. At least then we may have a chance of crossing paths again in the future. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get a drink of water, stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, what do we say, Ernie? Sleep safe. I feel like one of those beauty influencers in 2016 that everybody wanted to be. This is a ghost in the shade, glow in the dark by Bodmin Jail. Nailed it.